Hi, my name is Ben Burgis. I'm the author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, and also the host now of a podcast, a YouTube show called Give Them an Argument, Episode 3, featuring Gene Bajalan, Eric Levitz, Matt Chrisman from Chapo Trap House, and Megan Day from Jacobin, is premiering on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Ben Burgis GTAA tonight at 7:30 Eastern Standard Time. But what I want to talk about right now is an article that I recently wrote for Ryan Smith's new Substack project, The Third Rail, called The Quest for the Mythical Class Reductionist. And the reason that I wrote that kind of comes out of a couple things, right? So one, the good part, is that class politics, in other words, a political perspective that explicitly and unapologetically says that we should care about class antagonism, that we should be on one side of that class antagonism, has been slowly but making a comeback in the United States in the last decade, starting with Occupy Wall Street, going into the 2016 Bernie Sanders campaign, the growth of DSA, etc. All of these things are imperfect in their own way. None of them are the revolution, but they are all very promising signs, enough so that you'd think that anybody who is a socialist, who pretty much definitionally is all about class politics, would be popping some very affordable champagne to celebrate. Instead, I've been seeing this odd trend where people who, everybody I'm going to be criticizing in what follows considers themselves to be a socialist, and I'm not saying that in a snotty way, like they consider themselves to be a socialist, but really, I'm just talking about categorization, political self-identification, that they're writing from the perspective of socialists criticizing other socialists. And the criticism, which is odd, right, considering that socialists are all about emphasizing the importance of class and class struggle and trying to bring it more to the center of politics, the criticism is that they think that some socialists have been doing too much of that, right? Have been emphasizing class too much at the expense of other things. In other words, that they are class reductionists. Now, that's kind of a slippery term. As we go on, right, going to get into a couple of different things that people might mean by it. Oftentimes it's very unclear what they mean. But let me just give a few examples of what I'm talking about. So there's an article by Tatiana Cozzarelli in Left Voice a little while back called Class Reductionism is Real, and it's coming from the Jacobin wing of DSA. So I guess since I'm a columnist for Jacobin, that would include me, right? I'm also a DSA member, so I guess I'm on the Jacobin wing of DSA, so I guess Tatiana Cozzarelli thinks I'm a class reductionist. Or if not me, right, then a lot of people who share roughly those same political parameters. There's also an article by Asad Haider in Salon just a couple weeks ago. I talk about it a bit in the article, but I'm going to leave it out here because in response to the article, Haider claims that no, I was misreading him. He's not saying anybody's a class reductionist. I don't think that's the most natural reading of the article, but I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and leave him out here. Finally, the popular left-wing YouTube debater Vaush V has said this very recently.
Can you name some online class reductionists that are prominent? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Kyle Kulinski, Sauger's not a leftist, so fuck him. Jimmy Dore is an easy one. Kyle Kulinski flirts with that language pretty often, I would argue. Why did chat just freak out? Peter Coffin does that. Angie Speaks does that. Ashley Coffin does that to an extent. Who's the name of that one? Glenn Greenberg? Glenn Greenberg, right? Glenn, I'm pretty sure Glenn does this to a pretty significant extent. He's Greenwald. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. The Chapo Trap House boys do this to an extent. Dude, I need to watch it again, but I'm pretty sure in the Chapo episodes they've been getting a lot more class reductionist or I don't know, black-pilled. Yeah. Jimmy Dore and Angie Speaks aren't lefties at this point. Yeah. Peter Coffin's not a class reductionist. Listen, I'm really sorry. Look, okay, Peter Coffin has been nothing but kind to me, and I've been nothing but kind to Peter Coffin in direct interactions. I'm pretty confident that Peter Coffin's a class reductionist, and sometimes the takes they give are so bad it makes my heart ache. Okay, it gives me a fucking ulcer. Okay, I just listen. I'll have them on to talk at some point in the near future.
So, is there anything to these criticisms? And what does it even mean to be a class reductionist? I mean, obviously, there's a pretty clear sense in which, definitionally, if you're a socialist, you're a reductionist about class in the sense that you want to reduce class to non-existence. That the entire point of socialism is to create a society that's not divided into a working class and a ruling class, where there are no classes in that sense anymore. But of course, that's not what anybody means when they talk about class reductionism. Since my academic background is in analytic philosophy, when I hear reductionist, oftentimes what I hear is what people in that field mean when they talk about reductionism. For example, there are positions in the philosophy of science according to which we should be reductionist about biology or chemistry, in the sense that the truths that are studied in this field, those fields, in this view, reduce to truths about physics. That, in other words, there aren't really distinct biological truths. Biological truths are just really complicated, kind of shorthand formulations of truths about physical particles. Or to be a physical reductionist about philosophy of mind, depending on the version, and it's really not worth getting into a huge digression about it here, but is to think that mental states like thoughts and feelings ultimately just are either brain states in the sort of simplest, easiest to understand version of physical reductionism about minds, or they're input-output functional states of brains and nervous systems and everything else that's involved in behavior, as in views like Gilbert Ryle's behaviorist account or later functionalist accounts like you get from people like Dennett. But here's the thing. I think that there's a sense in which some people who come out of a Marxist tradition might be reductionists in this analytic philosophy sense of reductionism about class and, for example, race. That it's certainly true that the sort of racial ideology that's been such an important part of American society, certainly in the last couple hundred, well, more than that, right? Since European colonization started, has its roots in economic factors. That if you are going to enslave people and colonize them and dispossess them and all that stuff, then that's much easier if you can tell yourself some sort of story about how they're a different kind of human being than you, or not quite a human being. And of course, there's economics at the base of that. So as the great historian Barbara Fields puts it in Racecraft, it would be a huge mistake to talk about the history of race relations in the United States as if the primary purpose of slavery were the production of white supremacy, not the production of cotton, sugar, and tobacco. So again, if what you mean by reductionism is that what looks like a sort of freestanding ideological or cultural structure is really a sort of complex expression of economic stuff going on underneath, then a lot of people in the Marxist tradition might be reductionists about class to race in that sense, and to a certain extent they should be. Not entirely, because racial bias does have something of a life of its own, right? Even though it ultimately originates, certainly in the forms we know it, in economic factors, it certainly persists and cause bad effect in ways that don't always have immediate economic causes. But here's the other thing about reductionism in this sense. It's not obvious that would even be politically controversial or interesting, because reductionism in this abstract analytic philosophy sense of reductionism is not a position on whether or not something's important. It's not a position on what we should do about it. It's a position on how, on an abstract theoretical level, we should understand it. So, for example, Gilbert Ryle, for a long time, that physical reductionist philosopher of mind that I just mentioned, lived with his twin sister Mary. I'm pretty sure that if Mary told him that she was mad at him, Gilbert Ryle didn't respond that, oh, that's not important because that's not important that you're mad at me because really feelings are just reducible to functional states of physical systems. And similarly, whatever you think causes or in some sense constitutes racism, you can still think that racism is a big problem that we should focus a lot of energy on. Those are just separate questions. So, Adolph Reed, who's one of the people who's almost always accused of class reductionism, when some socialists warn about the dangers of class reductionism, has defined it this way in his essay where he's denying that it applies to him. He says, class reductionism is the supposed view that inequalities apparently attributable to race, gender, or other categories of group identification are either secondary in importance or reducible to generic economic inequality. It thus follows, according to those who hurl the charge, that specifically anti-racist, feminist, or LGBTQ concerns, for example, should be dissolved within demands for economic redistribution. Okay, now, that's a fairly clear definition, and he argues convincingly in the essay that that doesn't apply to him. In fact, it doesn't apply to anybody he knows, right? There are probably 5 people on Reddit it applies to, but that's about it. But I've also heard people who take the class reductionism charge more seriously than Reed does, or that I do, say, no, Reed is just strawmanning here. That's not really what people mean. But what do they mean, right? That's at least a clear definition. Unfortunately, it's very rare for those who are sounding the alarm bells about this to respond with a clear definition of their own. So here is part of the debate that I had with Vaush about class reductionism on his channel. So that doesn't bother me that much, but like if somebody suggests that I'm or whoever, right, is uninterested in or is hostile to things like things like combating racial bias in the criminal justice system, things like protecting gay and trans people against discrimination, then that strikes me as a fairly serious accusation, right? Like that'll get my back up. I'm very bothered about that accusation.
Yeah, I would. Well, I don't consider it synonymous to calling a person racist or sexist necessarily. More along the lines of that I feel they're of the impression that sometimes there is a mutually exclusionary relationship between advocating for one of the other. I have met many people, and some even public figures, who have made the argument that that advocating for race issues should be avoided in leftist circles because it ostracizes a large portion of the white electorate who might otherwise be swayed. I have argued with people like that. I have seen people like that. And while it is impossible for me to know whether this is them just being racist and finding a socially permissive way of not wanting to deal with those issues, or whether it is some genuine misconception on their part, it is impossible for me to say. But I think the characteristics are present in, at least to some extent or another, in a great many people. I wouldn't say, if I say somebody has class reductionist tendencies, that this is like some severe moral condemnation. Only that I think there are some ways in which they could reassess their approach towards intersectionality as a concept. But if you, again, it was an offhand. If you want, I can find a bunch of receipts and I could go over it. But I felt like, given the priorities right now, with us pretty much on the cusp of being black-bagged, I shouldn't lean too heavily into the ostracization of other left-leaning pundits online at this particular point in time, maybe during a more boring month.
A lot of the specific people that Vaush mentions, right? This is a little odd because, he mentioned, well, he meant Glenn Greenwald, right? He said Glenn Greenberg in the original clip I showed you earlier. But Glenn Greenwald, for example, is a gay man who very often talks about gay rights issues. He is also someone who has talked extensively about the various evils of the Bolsonaro regime in Brazil, and his main issue for many years, what he was primarily doing at Salon and The Guardian, was talking about the persecution of Muslim Americans by the federal government. So this is somebody who does not seem to think that everything except for class is just unimportant. Everything except for straightforwardly and obviously economic issues. Similarly, Angie Speaks is a black woman who often talks about the black freedom struggle. She certainly has every time I've been on the podcast she hosts, Low Society. Crystal Ball very frequently pushes back against her conservative co-host, Sagar Anjeti, on issues related to the post-George Floyd protests. But even apart from why I find his examples so unconvincing, I also think that there's a larger problem with Vaush's analysis, which is that he seems to be saying that, okay, class reductionism means the specific formulation I've heard him use is thinking that social progress is an unimportant distraction from economic progress, and that the way we can tell that somebody thinks it's an unimportant distraction is that they're too soft on Trumpian right-wing populism, and the way we can tell that they're too soft on Trumpian right-wing populism is that they don't agree with the tactical and strategic argument for lesser evil voting. I find this extremely odd because even, whatever your position is on lesser evil voting, you don't have to look around that much to see clear evidence all around that what people think about the respective importance of these various issues is a completely separate issue from what they think about the strategic, or in some people's minds, moral question of whether we should engage in lesser evil voting or vote for third-party candidates or not vote, right? In other words, Adolph Reed, who's very often accused of class reductionism, had an essay in 2016 called "Vote for the Lying Neoliberal Warmonger, It's Important," and he was very solidly behind the lesser evil strategy. Conversely, there are people who consider themselves to be black nationalists who refuse to vote for Biden because of his history of support for mass incarceration. So these are just separate issues, and it's just not analytically useful to try to read backwards from what somebody says about the election to alleged softness on right-wing populism to the view that nothing but economics matters. Gonna disregard Hader because, again, he now says that it was not his intention to accuse anybody of class reductionism, and just go to Cosarelli and wrap up with her, because she's very clear on why she thinks that her targets. So that's the Jacobin wing of the DSA, but it's not just them, right? They're the example in her title. She also says Bernie Sanders is a class reductionist, and Bernie Sanders, former press secretary and current affairs contributor, I think maybe editor, Brianna Joy Gray. Nathan Robinson's the main editor. She might be a contributing editor or something. I'm not 100% sure about her title. But Cosarelli says Bernie Sanders, Brianna Joy Gray, and I guess various Jacobin writers who are in DSA are class reductionists. And the specific reason that she gives is that all of these people aren't on board with the demand for racially targeted reparations, but instead they say that the best way to help close the economic gap between white people and those black and brown people who are hit hardest by current capitalist structures is through universal demands, right? So obviously those people on her list, there's a range going from people who are just social democrats to people who have more radical long-term ambitions, and certainly plenty of people on that list who maybe mostly talk about social democratic stuff right now because that's hard enough to get through right now, but who might be friendly to those more radical long-term ambitions. In any case, separate argument. And here's the thing about that this is not an argument about whether racial disparities are symptoms of injustice or important, or whether the history of de jure racial apartheid, going through slavery and into Jim Crow and FHA redlining, that led to those economic disparities is important. Right? Everybody involved in this debate thinks that all of that stuff is important. Nobody involved thinks that that the disparities between white and black Americans economically are a result of happenstance within a basically fair market system, or culture or bad choices or any of that nonsense. Right? Everybody thinks that there's a pretty straight line from those historical factors to current disparities. The question that we're arguing about is, given that, what's the best way to end those disparities? What's the best strategy? And I think a good analogy, right? It's kind of a goofy analogy. There are lots and lots of ways in which these two situations are not like each other, but an analogy that trains our focus on the analytically important distinction here is this. So think about the relationship between black poverty and poverty by members of other racial groups in the United States by analogy to a serial killer who's got a bunch of people trapped in his basement. And let's say this particular serial killer really, really hates Asian people, and he tries to target Asian people whenever possible. So the 10 people trapped in his basement, 6 of them are Asian, 4 of them are white or black. And the 6 Asian people got into the basement because they were specifically targeted because of his anti-Asian animus. Maybe one of the other 4, saw him kidnap one of the Asian people, so he kidnapped him, so he wouldn't be a witness. Maybe the other 3 were just in the wrong place at the wrong time and targets of opportunity. Regardless, the point that's important here is that right now they're all in the basement. Right now, they all need exactly the same thing, which is to get out of the basement. Right now, the best way of getting all of them out of the basement, and again, the basement here is poverty, right? That if we're talking about the economic disparities, this analogy applies. Now, there's also racial bias. There are also cops and other, state officials who act on the basis of racial bias, and obviously that's a separate issue that has to be addressed separately. And that if we care about basic civic and legal equality, which we shouldn't tolerate racial bias from officials of the state. But if we're talking about poverty, then the analogy applies. Everybody is in the basement. Everybody needs to get out of the basement. And everybody's best shot for getting out of the basement is to work together. So the much reviled Adolph Reed has a good article about this in Common Dreams right now that he co-wrote with Walter Ben Michaels, in which he points out that, quote, "It is practically impossible to imagine a serious strategy for winning the kinds of reforms that would actually improve black and brown working people's conditions without winning them for all working people, and without doing so through a struggle anchored to broad working class solidarity." In other words, the problem with the demand for racially targeted reparations is, A, it's going to be a lot less politically effective. There's much less chance of building a broad majoritarian movement for it than one based on economic gains for everybody in the working class that you could fight for on the basis of everybody's self-interest. And 2, even if we did somehow achieve them, that would still leave a bunch of people in that serial killer's basement. And so this is ultimately the point, that the charge of class reductionism is both unfair and unhelpful. It's unfair because if you're going to accuse people of being indifferent to, or maybe even hostile to, efforts to counter the poisonous effects of bigotry, you need much better evidence than I've seen anybody present in any of these discussions. But that's the reason that it's unfair. The reason it's unhelpful is because relentlessly emphasizing that the fight for socialism serves the interests of poor and working people of all backgrounds is our best chance of getting everybody out of the basement.
Thanks for watching this Zer0 Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zer0 Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zer0 Books book club and help us to continue making online content from the left.